please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. Secretary, please take roll.
Commissioner Blanova.
I'm here.
Commissioner Creech.
Present.
Commissioner Johnson.
Here.
Commissioner Kalis.
Here.
Commissioner Powers is here, and Chairman Rafato.
Here. We have no changes to the agenda unless you're going to do one, Steve, for the first time on? No? Okay, good. Citizen concerns and comments. I don't believe we have any. We have no consent items. We have no items for review and no items, approval of minutes. Other business, presentation regarding the update to the station area plan. Mr. Jennings?
Thank you, Chairman Rafato. The process that we're undergoing right now, I think, started probably in earnest about a year ago. We had a joint meeting with the Plan Commission and the board where we discussed some of the needs that we had to update certain aspects of the comprehensive plan, in particular the plan for the area around the train station. The village manager worked with the staff following that and provided us the direction to come back to the board with a proposal for an RFP that we then sent out. We worked to come, I guess, before we actually sent the RFP out, we defined the process that we wanted to go through somewhat. We did get a few proposals. The consultant was selected through that RFP process. And we've been working with them since that point to provide a update for what we view to be an obsolete aspect of our comprehensive plan. The station area plan was approved in 2004, not long after the comprehensive plan was adopted, and we found it to be functionally obsolete. It's not a tool that the village can use to guide development at this time. So we set out on this project to provide both the development community, the village staff, as well as the Plan Commission and the village board, a functional tool, a real true guide that illustrates the vision for the village of Wheeling, as well as steps to implement that vision. So without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Doug Farr from Farr & Associates, who is the lead for the consultant team that was selected to help us with this project. So, Mr. Farr.
Good evening. Thank you, Andrew. Good evening, Plan Commission. I'm Doug Farr, president of Farr Associates, and I'd like to introduce our consultant team. So on my team, Tim Kirkby is the project manager. Mercedes Harris, right, I knew that, is a staff planner. We have Bridget Lane from BDI Business Districts, Inc., and then Jane Wilberding from Sam Schwartz Engineering. So the three firms have been locked downstairs. We were not allowed to leave the place for 3 days. So if we're a little gamey, we'll recover. But we've been working very hard on behalf of the people of Wheeling to develop a station area plan. We've seen a majority of you one-on-one over the last couple days, not everybody. But we ran what's called a charrette. It's a French word for cart, and worth telling the story, which is it's a tradition that dates back to the 18th century at the first school of architecture ever, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and students would be working towards a deadline, and when you had to turn your drawings in when the cart went by. If your drawings were on the cart, you were graded. If they weren't on the cart, you were late. And so the whole process of working towards a deadline came to be named after the cart. And then the famous story is the students that were still working, just as we were now, would climb on the cart to get another 2 or 3 minutes to kind of finish things up. So we're right. Meeting started at 6:30. The PowerPoint went in at 6:28. It's a perfect charrette. So, but what the charrette does is it makes direct lines of communication. It's not a game of telephone. You know, what does he think? What does she think? Well, he or she is standing right in front of you. You can ask them. And if they have a suggestion or idea, we can draw it right in front of them and test it on the spot. So we've worked through, we have a big, sorry, Andrew, we have a big pile of paper that we sketched and discarded. You know, you run through ideas. That's downstairs. If you want to pick through it, it's there for a little while. But what we're going to do is show you kind of the results of our 3 days. It is definitely labeled draft. We're comfortable calling it draft. There's a lot of gaps, a lot of kind of refinement to do, but we wanted to bring it to you while it was fresh in people's minds and fresh in our minds. So what we've got about a 40-slide deck, and you all have screens, is that right? You can see it, okay. And then this is being recorded, is that right, for folks at home? So
And it's on TV right now.
on TV right now, wow. What shows does it compete with, you know?
Well, the Packers are on tonight, so that could be a tough.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll do our best. So,
sure
you know,
this
maybe
will
we'll
get
get people
higher
on the commercial breaks or something like that. So,
Doug, can I interject real quick one thing? Sorry, over here.
oh, yes.
For anybody who's tuning in at home at this moment, I think it's important to note where we are in the process.
Yeah.
This charrette is sort of the second step. There was a stakeholder group that met. The charrette occurs. The charrette produces a set of materials that will be displayed here tonight. The materials that came out of the charrette will then be posted. We'll have a link on the village website. We will be encouraging people. If you don't make it to the end of this meeting, I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew where we're going next. The materials from the charrette that were produced by this exercise will be posted. We'll have a link through the village website. We would be asking for feedback on it before it's refined and then brought back for an actual recommendation. So the feedback from the Plan Commission, the feedback from the public, they'll all be utilized to further refine the plan before it's brought back here, hopefully for a recommendation in the next few weeks, month or so, okay?
So just clarification, so when does the village board see the draft?
The village board will see the draft as everybody else has seen the draft. The village board will have access to it, but the idea of this would be to let the Plan Commission, with its duty of making recommendations to the board, go through the feedback that's received by the public from this point forward, and then you'll have a recommendation to the board at that point, and they would see. They're certainly welcome to provide feedback throughout the process as well.
Great, thank you.
Perfect, thanks. Yeah, so I should say that over the last 3 days, the schedule included a couple of fairly precise scheduled meetings. We have a steering committee. Andrew can fill you in on, there's a lot of staff and kind of key village staff is principally our steering committee. One Plan Commission member, Jim, and Mary from City Council. And so we met with them on Monday morning to kick us off. We met with them Tuesday afternoon to sort of do a progress report, a presentation, get some feedback. That steered us, both of those meetings steered us in a very different direction, a good direction from what we were doing. Not that we were screwing up or anything like that, but it made it much better. We had we had scheduled times with developers and key personnel through the day Monday and Tuesday. We had, was it Monday night and Tuesday morning? Also, we had drop-in time, and we had, Jeff was one of those folks that I think was there Monday night, right?
It was actually Tuesday
That was
morning.
Wednesday.
It was Tuesday morning, Wednesday afternoon for the steering committee.
Okay, we saw you Tuesday night? No, it was at night. We saw you at night. Tuesday, last night.
Tuesday night.
Oh, my God. Already, it's a blur. That was last night, 24 hours ago. Okay.
Okay.
No, 48 hours.
48 hours
Today's
ago.
Thursday.
Oh, that's what's wrong. Okay, sorry. Who's on first? Who's on first? You get my point. So we're a little fuzzy, but let me take you through it. So we've met with probably all told a couple dozen people over the last 3 days. And we started with some guiding principles. And let me just say that where we are on that is what we'd like to do, and we probably aren't there yet, is to have a kind of set of established sort of goals and objectives against which we might judge the plans. So we do have 3 plans to show you tonight, and I will talk about those in a couple minutes. But anyway, in terms of guiding principles, we have sort of 4 themes we came up with, and I'm going to call on both Bridget and Jane to help describe a couple of these things. So here are the 4 kind of, first of all, we're calling the project Greater Wheeling, which is not, it's not trademarked. You can steal it and use it if you want. but the idea was it was greater captured the dual meaning of improved as well as grown, larger. So those two things, greater Wheeling. So, and that it's not just the station area, that it encompasses, you know, some radius, half mile or so around the station area. But we're going to talk about these four things. Bridget will make the case that we need to add people. I will describe a process and a tool to basically to regulate future development to make it a walkable place. Jane will take us through connections across, along, and parallel to Dundee, and then we'll lead you through the three scenarios. So that's where we are. We organize the three scenarios this way. If you like diagrams, there's a couple of them there. But the gist of it was it's organized essentially according to the level of effort asked of the village of Wheeling. So the easiest one being essentially regulate. The next one is essentially build roads, regulate and build roads. The third one is regulate, build roads, and support the assemblage of land. So kind of low, medium, high, or easy, moderate, harder kind of thing. So we'll show you those in a minute. So with this, I'm going to call up Bridget to talk about why we might need to add people. And I think you advance.
That way. Okay. Thank you very much. So my role in this is to help guide the process so that what we have is a plan that really responds to the market today and into the future. So the first thing I did was to look at what are the markets we want to be careful about. And today, one of the most important changes is the fact that we have existing markets that are important. The first one is, how many of you ever shop on your cell phone? Come on. And so what's happened today is people now shop everywhere, but they buy at stores. They shop for where they're going to go to a restaurant. And so what it's done is it's extended the size of the market in most cases. And in this case, in this case, we have existing markets that are a 30-minute drive time. And the reason for that is that 30 minutes is about how far the typical Chicago person travels to go to their job. And also, if you shop at home or you shop at work and you hit a directions button, that's about how far you might drive to get something that were different and unusual. And what's interesting about that is that for your market, that's 1.4 million people, and it's 1.1 million jobs. So what that means is if someone lives in Wheeling, they have a choice of 1.1 million jobs at the typical drive time of the Chicago market. And what does that mean? What it really means is that at one point in time, you might have had a consultant in my position come in and say, here's the 6 uses that are really missing and that you really need to attract. But because of this expansion of the market, it's now more important that you create forms and environments that attract the businesses. And that's really the change. And I just want to stop and say, as I would go out into the development community and say I'm working in Wheeling, they would go, wow, that's really impressive what they're doing. So I really feel like I'm working with a community that understands this, that you're going to hit those markets, you're going to hit those markets right now, and you are with the development that's happening here. The other important market is your community, and it's the ownership and the pride they take. So if someone comes to visit you, let me take you to the best of Wheeling, and we believe that's part of Greater Wheeling. And so that's a population of 38,000. We also have a half mile, which is what we're going to use throughout this process for this walkable market. And here you can see that population is 2,460 according to the typical demographic service that someone would use, 1,205 jobs. So the next slide is going to take a look at how do we make that better for Wheeling. Here we go. This is actually what I just said. I had an extra slide in there. This is the map of that important 30-minute drive time, and that was what I really wanted you to be able to see. I told you this is charrette. We had an extra slide in there, and I talked about it. And so anyway, this is basically a repeat of what I said, but I wanted you to see that 30-minute market. It takes you to O'Hare, it takes you almost to Wisconsin, and in all seriousness, if you think about the way people are shopping today, that's what you have access to. And that's why I'm not here saying, boy, the thing that's missing here is, is a drugstore or whatever. It's really that the way people shop today has changed, and has changed that, and it's going to change how we plan. So what I'm saying is the market's not the limit. It's your ability to compete fearlessly, and that's what we've sort of charged as a person here, and that's really what you've been doing, and that's why you have the development you have. And because of that, the form is going to be more important than the use here, so that the form promotes walking, it promotes entrepreneurship, it does all kinds of things. So this goes to that last category, which is the one that concerned me the most as I started to look at your market. So Wheeling Town Center today, according to the typical census tract data that someone would use, you have a population of 2,460, 1,205 jobs. So I just did a combination. Now, what I did is you have not included in that 2,460, and this is something to understand as developers or somebody look at your community. I could tell from the number of people living in a development of 50 units or more that they didn't yet have Northgate Crossing in there, and they don't have any of your additional development in there. So if you assume that all 900 units have an average of 1.5 people living in them, your population right now is already set with your approved projects to be at 3,810. I don't know of, and you could inform, that's a nice thing about a charrette, come back and let me know, but I didn't know of any major employment increases that were also part of that. But what I did is I said, so let's talk about, when you create a walkable environment, the one thing you need is people to walk in that environment. So the question was, how many more units do we need? So that's the guidance to the program here. And how many more jobs might we want to have in order to create that walkable environment as part of the plan? So what I did is I just took a look at Park Ridge, Arlington Heights, Palatine, and Mount Prospect. Not saying any of them are perfect, but looking at how does your market compare to those markets. So what you can see in terms of the people living there, even at 3,800, you're still short of these communities that you might think are walkable. So it's said to us in the planning process, we got to put more places for people here. So you're not done yet. It doesn't mean you have to put more apartments in, but it means you need more people. And as you can see, the jobs also were an issue. So what it said is we want to make places where there can be jobs in this market. Okay, so this is just a framework for planning at this point. What were some of the other activities today that guide will leave the market guiding planning? So the first thing is you have current market development, and what you want to do is continue and expand that programming. So you're going to be welcome. So anything we do needs to welcome the new residents that we know are coming. We want to retain the existing residents you have here and make them part of the new development. We want to support the new businesses. So in other words, the first thing we want to do is not necessarily compete with somebody we know is opening here in the next year. So the immediate idea was to support those businesses and to then improve the existing businesses to the quality standards of what we're bringing here. And we wanted to capitalize on your public recreation facilities, which are really, really important in this area. And we wanted to, in the initial stages, really increase jobs through entrepreneurship. And what that really meant was capitalize on some of the smaller businesses that are already in your area west of the tracks. And then, so as Doug said, we went through 3 stages. You might say this is kind of the guidance that goes with that first stage. And then as we progress through other levels of activity by the village in plan implementation, what are we achieving? We got to connect all the pieces that are here. Some of them are not connected, and you're going to hear about that. We need to re-tenant as needed. One of the differences in today's market from when I started in this business, people stay places and stay in business a lot shorter times. So that re-tenanting today is really important in supporting that, creating an environment that encourages that. We need to add more residents. You're going to hear me keep saying that. So we want to entice. It's great that you have renters coming here, we have to create products that entice them to remain as owners, create a relationship with Wheeling that allows them to grow and remain part of your community. And that involves providing what's called a full product offering. So you have the rental, we need to be able to grow into townhomes, we need to grow into products that support young families here by places for their parents maybe to move to town, which, believe it or not, that's the most common move that seniors make, is to be closer to their grandchildren. So we need places where they can live. We need to integrate old buildings with new. From the very first time we met with the group, we talked about authenticity. What does it bring? That building you can see in the picture here is somewhat similar to what you might do to integrate some of the old buildings west of the tracks. So that's what I'm talking about, figuring out in planning ways, how can you make them look good, but still retain the economics of an existing building. And then we want to, as an ultimate goal, attract signature jobs. People ask me, what is that? That's the name employer that comes here because their employees have all the amenities that are around. So that's the guidance that was given to the charrette from the market perspective.
Does anyone have questions for Bridget while she's here? Not right now.
Making sense? Good guidance? Great. Thank you.
In that additional 900 units that you're talking about, is that, that's Northgate?
Yeah.
The,
It's a general number, yeah. It's Northgate, the 500,
Okay.
and also one Wheeling.
okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So when you talk, well, we'll probably get to it when you talk.
No, that's okay.
What we discussed was the half-mile radius. Do we have did you put up a map that shows what the half-mile radius is, and will it be in here?
Yes.
Okay, good, that's fine.
And a half mile from town center?
From town center.
Okay, so I figured.
Actually, I think, did you use
That is
the station?
the station.
The station?
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So just to build on Jim's comment about the half-mile radius, in an ideal sense, it's a half mile, but Dundee lops off, imagine a circle, it's like a circle with the top bit missing, and then Elmhurst lops that off if we don't connect things. So Jane will talk about connectivity in a minute. So we think the basis of greater Wheeling is walkability, that this wants to be a walking district. And we do an analysis in every project, and this is really tiny to see, I apologize for that, but we map all of the pedestrian paths on the major streets, red, yellow, and green. And green is rewarding and safe. So imagine a kind of nice main street, tree-covered, parked cars, tree zone, park benches, wide sidewalks, storefronts. Main Street, USA. That'd be a great green. Poor or sort of average is, it's a walk path that there's a sidewalk, you can walk on it, and it's not a driveway, so the cars should not be in your same space, but it's unrewarding. And you'll see this a lot along Dundee where, for various reasons, the sidewalk has been attached to the back of the curb. So, on one side of the curb, there are cars supposed to be going 35, but might actually be going 40, 45, or 50, 2 feet from you, and then your sidewalk is jammed right to the curb. And so already that's not best practice. You keep the pedestrians away from the moving cars if you can do it at all. And then red is where the pedestrian path and the car path are in conflict, a driveway, a curb cut, whatever you want to call them. The analysis we did here was, I want to say it was percentage of 4% red? 4% red, which is, I'm sorry, 4% green. So in a good TOD, transit-oriented development, we'll find they're, 70, 80% green. You have 4. And ironically, the 4% green were in front of the 2 fast food restaurants along Dundee. So just kind of quirky that it happened that way, but we are starting at a very low point in terms of, places you would willingly walk. Red was, 11% of the frontage, and that's a lot of, cars that have just been going 50 miles an hour a second ago, cutting in front of the pedestrian path. So all those are signals you should not walk here. So, to Jim's comment about half mile, walking along Dundee, walking along Elmhurst, and some of these other internal streets, there are investments needed to kind of upgrade this stuff. But we call this analysis PED zones. But what I want to talk to you about is making a walkable place through zoning and design. So what I'm going to talk about, oops, and there's some text disappeared there, is the comparison between conventional zoning codes, described on the right here, and what's called the form-based code. And you see these colored boxes, but it kind of comes down to one idea, that conventional codes, zoning codes, so let me back up. Zoning codes were invented in the 1920s to segregate uses. So if you had a belching industry over here, you don't want a daycare center right next to it or housing right next to it. So the idea was, let's put the industry over there and the housing over there and the schools over there, this kind of thing. So that's what zoning was designed to do, was to segregate land uses. And as what form-based codes do is to say, industry, there's still noxious industry that should be separated, but there's a lot of ways that people make a living in jobs that are office, even sometimes light assembly or industrial, which is perfectly fine and can be compatible, doesn't generate noise, smoke, vibration, all the kind of classic harms from industry, and can be mixed up with other things. And so the form-based code emphasizes the form of the development over the use. Use is still regulated, but form takes precedence. And so this builds also on what Bridget said a couple minutes ago, which is the market, you're so connected to so many places and such purchasing power, the market can support a lot of different uses here. So this is an introduction to that. The other difference here, again, the conventional code zoning is characterized on the right. It is text. It's a text document. The attorneys of the world are very comfortable with it. The rest of us struggle. Whereases and therefores and so on. What's nice about moving to a form-based code is the public at large can open it up and maybe have an easier time figuring out what's permitted, because the form-based code will rely on diagrams and drawings, and so it's much more graphic. I don't want to say like a comic book, but easier to read. Also, the diagrams, for the early years, there was a question about whether they were legally binding, but now the diagrams can substitute for text. So in the early years, you would do a diagram, and then the lawyers would tell you, okay, write it out in words too. And that actually created problems, because sometimes the word translation of the diagram wasn't perfect, and now you had an internal conflict because you described it two different ways. Drawings are actually a very clear way to describe buildings, because drawings are volumetric or can be a volumetric drawing and so on. So you can kind of see what we're talking about here. So mostly graphic versus mostly text. And then another sort of comparison, head-to-head comparison again, conventional zoning is you will get large swaths of a town with the same zoning, right? On the left, in this case, the form-based coding, is mapped much more specifically. Like the end of a block facing a street might have different zoning than jump the alley and it changes there. So if you want to make a really great street, you might zone that one street to a certain way. So it's a very sort of a jeweler's tool rather than a kind of a painting with a roller, what do you call it, a roller, one of those things. So it's fine versus broad. And this is a tool that suits us in trying to make the downtown, a walkable place. And this is also again on the right, the post-war forms of which you have a lot of, auto-oriented land uses and so on, where the buildings are set back, the pedestrian realm is not, favored and so on, compared to the example on the left here, where the house, in this case just a house, is pulled up to the back of the sidewalk. There's a porch. You can see why you might want to walk in front of that house. You might greet a friend sitting on the porch and, hey, how are you? So, the entrance is on the front. There's windows on the front. That's part of what a form-based code does, is it assures that you can't put a blank wall on a public street, because that's not what a pedestrian would want. So, and this is a kind of a classic diagram that we show that describes the difference between the two types of codes. A conventional zoning code will often regulate the bulk, minimum setback, maximum height, and you get this kind of pancake, what do you call those, flat cakes? I'm not a baker. What do you call the cake pan? Sheet cake. It's a sheet cake pan kind of put over the top of your parcel, and you can do anything within that you want to, but it doesn't have to look like anything whatever. Then you, next jump up is to focus on form. And that is to say, break it down. We actually don't want it to be a big lump. Pedestrians like it when there's variety along a streetscape. When, you think of the old kind of Main Street where the lots were 30 feet or 40 feet wide, and the building changed every 30 or 40 feet. So there was an entrance, there was a new storefront to look in, or a new house, porch to check out, that kind of thing, as opposed to a 300 or 400 foot long facade that's got one entrance in it. Like, yeah, I'd rather not walk along that. So anyway, that's the kind of how you can use tools like that. And then this is a diagram that talks about how, in the case of the two upper diagrams, where you have an auto-dependent use, and then you can do what's called either suburban retrofit or sprawl repair, where you add development to that site to bring the new development closer to the sidewalk, and again, to create that pedestrian realm on the street. There's also another diagram I wanted to show you, which we talked about a lot the last couple of days. We'll touch on briefly today, which is called missing middle housing. And the gist of, what is this middle we're talking about and what's missing? It's the idea that across the country, we're really good at building single-family houses, and then in the other extreme, it's a building with an elevator. So, 4, 5, 6 stories. And the stuff in the middle is kind of what we forgot how to do or stopped doing. So townhouses, 2 flats, 3 flats, 6 flats, courtyard buildings, things like that is what we refer to as missing middle. And what's nice about this is that it can be more attainable, that is to say affordable for people. It is not subsidized. It is simply designed in a way where there's more shared walls and floors, and that they are also, enhancing of the density in a transit-served area. So that's kind of what we were, all of the schemes we're going to show you tonight assume that step one is for the village to adopt some sort of pedestrian code or form-based code in the greater downtown area. So maybe before I turn it over to Jane, does anybody have any questions on the zoning presentation? Jim?
So the form-based code, form-based zoning, that could be specific to an area?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's like taking an MXT and making that a form-based zoning area, if you will.
Yeah, it's done a couple different ways. Or we've done it a bunch of different ways. You can do it as an overlay on top of what you already have, depending on whether the underlying zoning permits all the things you want. Okay. So it would add more specificity. We did have a conversation briefly in the steering committee with Andrew about the issue of are Wheeling's current regulations predictable? Does a developer that buys a piece of land feel like the rules are clear enough for them to know what their investment, can turn into, right? And there seems to be some confusion. So what's nice about this is it really dead clarifies it. So, but sometimes adding a form-based overlay on top of underlying zoning now confuses people. It's like, well, wait, now I've got this and I've got that, and you're saying I got to do both, make it clearer. So other times you can just scrape the underlying zoning away from, a half mile by a half mile, whatever boundaries you say, and say that underlying zoning doesn't apply here. We've got a special, walkables district or form-based district, and then this becomes the primary zoning in that area. But you can do it either way.
I had a similar question, but so then when people do form-based code, it's per, like you said, it was set by parcel, or can be. Yeah. Versus a general, so it wouldn't be like we look at all of Wheeling and check every parcel, and like this parcel should be it's any given area that a developer is looking at, case by case, or like a sweeping whole town thing.
Yeah, so that one slide may be a little misleading. So you can do, parcel by parcel, but, zoning, the lawyer's present you can't do spot zoning, you can't, oh, you're my brother-in-law, I'm going to grant you something special, that sort of thing. It has to be in guidance of a greater purpose.
Sure.
But yeah. So I was going to say, just nationally, the way this goes is form-based codes are helpful in parts of towns that are undergoing some sort of transition. Either there's market pressures driving the change, or the municipality seeks to initiate the change. So, but like existing single-family neighborhoods on the edge where there's not much going on, leave it alone.
Yeah, right.
You know, zoning works fine, you know, people know the rules, that's fine. But here, you know, in terms of attracting a higher quality, you know, maybe in-town and out-of-town developers to do what you want here, that predictability can be helpful.
And you said a municipality could initiate that, so
Yeah.
would we petition ourselves? Like, how does that work for a village?
We change our code.
Okay, so
Yeah.
as village staff and, okay,
Working
I've never
with-
been part of,
Staff can put forth zoning.
You want
code
to talk
amendments.
into the microphone, Mallory?
Staff has the ability to make zoning code amendments.
Okay.
Through the plan commission process.
Right.
and then in those cases, they're the petitioner, the village to us?
No, we change code.
The
Okay.
village is the petitioner.
Village is a
Yeah.
petitioner, and they
Right.
present to us, but they
Right.
present to the plan commission.
Correct, okay.
We're we, as always, we're the recommending board
Right.
to the village board, who will then take those changes to our plan, to our code.
Same process, just
Right, yep.
Wheeling is just petitioning,
Exactly.
Wheeling.
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay,
in essence.
cool.
Yeah.
So is then, what I'm hearing is form-based zoning is, the implication is that it's easier for the developer to understand what we're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, the experience nationally, like, your current regulations tell someone that, you know, could be a 400-foot-long blank wall with the door on the back. And that would be, I don't know the specifics, but I'm guessing that could be built as of right on certain parcels here. And you say, well, wait, we wanted to make it nice for pedestrians. Your code doesn't require that. So I met code, give me a permit. So the fight starts because it's under design. So the kinds of things that a form-based code might regulate is to specify the location of entrances. You know, put your doors on this side. A pretty common one in the right building types, like a commercial or retail establishment, would be to specify a minimum transparency, typically like from 2 to 8 feet is the kind of stuff that a pedestrian can see. So you might say along your frontage for certain stretches, you know, no less than 60% or 70% of the 80% of the frontage shall be glass, so that I'm walking along and I'm not seeing a blank wall. There's, you know, we're getting down into the details, but one thing I would just say is when you adopt a walkable code and lay it over the top of existing auto-oriented uses, you know, this asks that the buildings be built, you know, closer to the street. If it's an existing strip mall, it's set back behind a parking lot. And so, you know, there's lots to work out, and, you know, Andrew and his staff have a lot of, you know, expertise and talent. I would just advise you to work with somebody. And just because of you can create nonconformities, and then everyone's like, well, wait a minute, what if my place burns down and my insurance will pay me to rebuild in this location, but doesn't reimburse me for new foundations 50 feet forward of where it is now? So there's like intricacies about how you do all this stuff. So, I was just, don't do it on, don't do it, what's
Just
that
don't
commercial?
put
Don't do it
pictures,
at home.
just don't put pictures in and say this is our.
This
form.
commercial performed by stunt actors, do not do this at home. So you get what I'm saying. So
Yes.
there's some nuance to it, but it's done all over the country. So I'm going to call now on Jane to lead us through connections across, along, and parallel to Dundee. Jane.
Thank you, Doug. What's this? Okay. So this is on your screen. The blue circle is a half-mile pedestrian walk. It's a 10-minute walk for pedestrians. So from a transportation perspective, that is what we perceive as a transportation-oriented development area, and this is really the area that we want to focus on. The darker blue circle is 1 mile from the metro station, and this is about a 6 or 7 minute bike. So this is what we would say is a bikeable area. So this is really, again, that area that we really want to focus this study on. And this is, you know, what it includes from more of a macro perspective. If we look at the next slide, well, the next slides will have it more zoomed in, sorry. But there are some real constraints within that half mile, as Doug mentioned previously. Dundee Road is a major constraint, and it kind of just cuts off some of the top part of that half mile. And so what we really want to do from an access perspective is really make this area more accessible to the residents that are coming in, to the visitors that are coming in, to the customers that are coming in, and make it more walkable. Dundee Road is, again, is a very high traffic volume road. It has a 29,000 average daily traffic volume, which is very high. But, you know, in addition to that, it is really exacerbated by the physical dimensions of the roadway. So, you know, there's a large number of curb cuts and driveways there. There's disjointed bike ped facilities along it because of those curb cuts and driveways. There are wide roadways up to 71 feet. This, you know, also leads to higher speeds. We know that the speed limit is about 35 miles an hour, but people go a lot faster than that on that roadway because of these wide lanes. And there's a large curb radius, which really deters pedestrians from crossing. Here's some other pictures. You know, it just decreases the comfort level of the pedestrian. It leads to having more people, you know, really want to drive and want to park, as opposed to really motivating them to want to walk and want to access more businesses and more spaces within one trip. And so this is something that we're really trying to address through, you know, going across, along, and parallel to Dundee, as I'm going to propose some of these solutions. The first one is crossing Dundee Road. There are several intersections, Elmhurst, McHenry, Northgate Community, all have intersections that have pedestrian crossings. Those amenities are there, but we really want to focus on some of these crossings that are less than 1,000 feet away, more like 5,000 feet, 500 feet from an intersection. So A and B both represent opportunity sites that could have a pedestrian island there. A is what we'll be talking about first, and that is just west of the railroad tracks, and B is just above the creek there. And so these are proposed, that is existing now. This is 71 feet wide, and this is just a brief rendering that we did today, showing what a potential pedestrian island would look like. This would again really encourage people to not to cross this major roadway, but it would also slow traffic and really, you know, signal them to recognize that along this section of Dundee, it is, you know, more of a slow section. You might want to look out for pedestrians as well. Same thing, this is by the railroad tracks, and this is the rendering that we developed today. Again, just, you know, signaling people to slow down and creating more of a safe space for pedestrians. The second is looking at creating these connections parallel to Dundee. These are some of the proposed roadways that we would kind of suggest for this area, and this is really about allowing, you know, these residential areas to access some of these retail areas, to access the park district, to access other residential areas. So really just increasing the connectivity of that area as a whole. C is a rendering that is, you know, on the next slide that shows this is a 30-foot roadway existing. And this is kind of just a rendering of what that might look like. If, you know, you can imagine there might be retail on the right side, or and then there's a sidewalk on the left, and really just livening up that area and taking some of the traffic off the roadway. Having on-street parking on the road would decrease the amount of parking that the developer would have to provide and decrease that parking footprint, just really increasing the connectivity of the area overall. Again, this is another little project that we wanted to highlight too, that we saw as an opportunity. There is the Buffalo Creek Trail here, which is that we would see connecting to. This is just a little bike facility that is, exists, that there is a little drainage ditch there this would just follow and be a really viable connection to Heritage Park and allow people to access this parkway and these paths in a non-vehicular way. And there seems that there's a fairly active community here, and it just seemed like a really great opportunity. And then we also wanted to talk about access management. This will be, talked about throughout the presentation that Doug will follow up with. But when you decrease the number of access points, of curb cuts, of driveways along a roadway, it allows you to have a more continuous bike ped facility, which ultimately improves and enhances the experience of the pedestrian. It also allows you to have the opportunity to have a landscaped median, which also creates a better, crossing potentially facility for pedestrians as well, as you can see here. And a shortened curb radius is also important. And then this is just another view of what that might look like along a railroad track. And this is in Hillside, just for reference. We also talked to IDOT because we do realize that Dundee Road is an IDOT-owned road, which tends to slow this all down. And we did kind of ask them what some of the key criteria are. They were very vague and fuzzy about the specifics, but they did really mention that having and monitoring the number of pedestrians and or cyclists along that roadway to ensure that there is kind of that demand for a pedestrian facility. So that kind of harkens back to what Bridget was mentioning about having more people in kind of this concentrated area. That would really enable them to do more walking, and then with that, it would then warrant the demand for a pedestrian island. Surrounding amenities, there's a park there, there's residences there, that really helps. Access points. If there's a large number of curb cuts, if there's a curb cut that's about to turn onto or in proximity to that pedestrian island that might hit a pedestrian, that would, make them less likely to do it. And, the distance from the nearest intersection, if there's an intersection with a signalized crossing nearby, they would be less likely to allow that. There's, as a kind of rule of thumb, they'd like to see pedestrian crossings about 500 feet from one another. And then, ultimately, these different development patterns would also, decrease the demand for parking, since this would be more of a mixed use, more of a dense area. So thinking through or keeping in mind some different parking strategies just for this TOD zone, this half-mile zone. Sharing parking with surrounding land uses, really creating more of a park once area, as we call it. So you park one time, maybe at the village, and then you can walk to the park, you can walk to the grocery store, you can, park one time and cross shop and not have to get in your car, park somewhere else, get back in your car, drive somewhere else, park, and it's just more of a seamless trip. And incorporating a TOD overlay zone with reduced parking requirements. We know that there's something like 4 cars per unit for residential here, so maybe just allowing development for just this half-mile area to reduce that number. And then on-street parking on new local roadways, that was shown in that rendering, but we see this as a huge opportunity to slow traffic and allow for increase the capacity of vehicles and reducing the parking footprint required. So kind of in conclusion, moving forward, the goal is to ultimately really prioritize the connections of pedestrian and increase pedestrian amenities, increase bike amenities for this half-mile radius of the metro station. You know, in zoning and infrastructure and housing, and really focusing on how to create a more walkable place and a more accessible place to the people using it. So that is the conclusion of the transportation section. Does anyone want to talk through any of those items, questions, concerns?
And please, if anybody has anything else to say, you know, could you bring up this slide right here? So the red are proposed parkways. So from Northgate going east, so that would be behind all the property, and then what you're saying here is that you would have a connection that would go into Community Boulevard. So in that perspective, that not undeveloped area there between Northgate Parkway and, let's use the post office as the easternmost part, the access there would be through the back. So the access to those properties, is that what this depicts?
I'm just going to point, no, I just want to understand. Jim, what are you talking about?
Go over to the right more. I'm sorry, yeah, my right, your left, right. Yeah, no, right, go
Maybe
the other
his
way.
right, too.
To the east. To the east. There you go. So that right there, from Northgate Parkway to the post office.
Post office,
Right, yeah,
Post
that
office
area
right
there.
Yeah.
So that implies that the only access to that undeveloped property right now would be through the back? Through that road there, that proposed roadway?
Yeah, so this is the parcel west of the post office.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
So yeah, we'll show you this again in the three schemes.
Okay,
The
great.
proposal is that there's a rear lane constructed that allows us to minimize, maybe eliminate altogether the driveways
right.
and curb cuts coming in and off of Dundee.
Right, which, okay,
Yeah,
cool. That's all if you're going to do it in one of the other,
Yeah.
that's fine.
we show it like 5 more times.
Okay.
Yeah, this is just to, you know, get you oriented to the following development typologies that will be shown.
Is it essentially like a river walk, but with a ditch? I mean, essentially,
It's-
Buffalo
yeah.
Creek.
it's not
Buffalo
neighbor.
Creek,
Buffalo-
Buffalo Creek. Okay. Go
I
ahead.
think the access to Wheeling Road is pretty important too. Out of Dunhurst like that, I think that's needed. So that, I mean, that's some good thought there. You know, I think it's some good work.
I was a little nervous when you were saying just west of the tracks that you were looking to slow it down for pedestrian, whatever. One of the challenges is, you know, traffic at the tracks now. So how do you, I don't know if there's some sort of number of like how many less cars there's going to be because there's more people walking and biking, and the traffic is just a gigantic problem anytime anyone talks about that area. So to slow down the traffic because of more pedestrians is seemingly a little nerve-wracking of a thought. So I don't know how you.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that there are pedestrians there now, and it's really important to provide these amenities for them as well as the vehicles. And, you know, at a railroad track, you don't really want to encourage cars to be going that fast around that area anyways. And, you know, when there's traffic, cars aren't really going very fast
Right.
anyway. So it's really about, you know, providing the amenity and the option for pedestrians as opposed to, you know, really prioritizing the increased speed and capacity for traffic.
I was just going to share that we had a full hour with Chief McIsaac, and he kind of briefed us on, you know, injuries and his perception of safe and unsafe conditions. And his advice about the tracks was that Dundee kind of crests at the tracks, and that he was concerned about anything that would put a driver or a pedestrian kind of below the horizon line of a driver. The decision to propose the median just west of the tracks, I think, it could be on those occasions when the gates are down for a train, it allows a person to just get across the street
Okay.
while cars are stacked. But all this requires a lot more conversation, and IDOT doesn't generally even approve this stuff.
No.
Try.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, the one thing that, once you report what you heard about.
Well, and you weren't that far from the signalized crossing at Dundee and Wheeling at that.
Yeah. The other thing that Doug reminded me was that IDOT will be completing a resurfacing of this portion of Dundee Road in 2021. And this is really an opportunity to, encourage, to get permits and approval, and, it would kind of ease the process of maybe making lanes smaller, maybe instead of 12 feet in width, 11 feet in width, or, incorporating a pedestrian island. He did mention that they would need the plans to be downstate by 2020, so they would need to be sent to District 1 by August of 2019 is really the ideal date for that. And again, that's, something that is happening that kind of presents itself as an opportunity.
Yeah, I love the idea. It's a great concept. I used to work in Highland Park. I'd come across this way every single day for 2 years, and it never got less frustrating waiting for the trains after. So like, you think about a driver waiting for the train, then they finally get it, and they're frustrated and they want to go.
Yeah.
I don't know that waiting for pedestrians is going to be the first thing on their mind. So that's the only reason I'm a little apprehensive about that concept, even though, unless it was an over the street walkway like we have over by Field, but I don't know.
I was going to just say, in an ideal, so this conflict is not unique to Wheeling.
Sure.
It's a national conflict between the folks that would like to make walkable places and the traffic engineers whose sole job, seemingly, is to move more traffic across town faster. And so
So I have to trust the traffic people, that's what you're saying.
we're going to let your sentence just land on the page with a period on it. And let me just say this, that the right way to do this, and we're going to propose this and we'll see what happens, is that a facility, which is the name that engineers give to a street like this, is that there are the facility passes through different contexts. So you can imagine the Eisenhower Expressway becomes Congress Boulevard, downtown Chicago. So it goes from 300-foot right-of-way right at the Auditorium Theater right there at Michigan Avenue, about 60 feet. So like it responds, they didn't tear down all those buildings and say that had to be 300 feet. So when you have the width to come back after the fact and say, you know what, Dundee Road in downtown Wheeling from X to Y for this half-mile stretch is a pedestrian-dominated zone, and the village has adopted that as guidance. Mm-hmm. So then the game comes to be, because Jane was very generous with IDOT, the lanes are 11 to 14 feet wide. 14 feet is interstate. It's interstate. So it could be, a semi-truck trailer and 3 trailers behind it. They're comfortable in 14 feet. So what is that doing in downtown Wheeling? So that's the kind of stuff. So in that pedestrian zone, we say it gets down to 11. They can do it with paint. They don't have to move curbs. So this is, tightening them down to 11-foot lanes through our pedestrian downtown here with paint is something that's completely attainable in 2 years, or 3 years when they do it. So it doesn't break any rules. They have to do it. So anyway.
Okay.
Any other questions for Jane?
Yeah, I have one more. I think it's pretty interesting. So just so I understand, by having the zoning we have now, trying to go and make it more pedestrian friendly and changing the zoning, what that's giving us is more flexibility and to possibly get the pedestrian crossings and make IDOT more receptive to doing that if we are going to say by doing this type of new zoning, we're going to be increasing the pedestrian traffic. at least they'll be more willing to listen to us if we say, yeah, we think we need a couple of pedestrian crossings. Is that kind of where we're going with this, some of this, in a way?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, if you alone say to IDOT, we're doing this form-based zone coding, I don't think that that would go very far for them. But I think that it's almost like a symptom of that zoning will be increased pedestrian traffic, and measuring that and seeing that and having, them measure that and see that would be very compelling to them.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to say, and I can't remember, we've had so many conversations with so many people in 3 days, whether this was Andrew or Chief McIsaac, but this issue that there were a couple of fatalities just east of here on Dundee in the last few years, and that was brought to IDOT's attention as justification to make some improvements there. And I think my impression was, and don't quote me, was even that didn't seem to move them. So was that you or was that Chief McIsaac?
That was me.
Yeah.
I think just to that point, anytime you have an agency of that size, the more committed that you are to the concept through approval of formal documents, the more likely they are to take seriously the proposal that you're putting forward. So having a plan like this that's paired with your active transportation plan, with your form-based zoning code, and then you have a concept for something, an improvement to their facility. I think that it just helps to really emphasize that this idea of defining a pedestrian zone, a pedestrian area within this area, it really shows the commitment that the village has to it. I think it carries more weight than just what our previous attempts at this have been. Studies that kind of floated in space. Look, we have an area here that seems dangerous. We'd like to do something about it. That's not a plan. That's trying to retrofit an area because you observed a problem. Mm-hmm. This is a more coordinated effort. So I think that if the village is going to take this to the next level, this is the kind of recommendation that you would want to put in a plan and demonstrate to an agency like IDOT that you are, in fact, this is an area, this is what we want to do with it, and please help us achieve that. I think it helps.
Just to belabor this one more minute, so west of you in Buffalo Grove, Dundee has a center median, and it's got trees in it.
Yeah.
It's Buffalo Grove? Yeah, Buffalo Grove. And I just show this slide just as a reminder, you can do that when you don't have curb cuts and driveways that allow a left turn, because otherwise you can't build the median because the left turn is permitted and they have to be able to go out. And so this issue of making Dundee pedestrian friendly, slowing cars down, is all related to, elimination of driveways or consolidation of driveways, what Jane calls access management. So these things work together. So if you have continuous driveways, you can't even ask for this. So if there's no more questions, I want to get through it because we're being very thorough. This is really good. I hope you guys are, sticking with it.
Thank you.
And at home too. So let's see. And then the last bit was realize the vision in 3 scenarios. So we have, just for our purposes, for our working purposes, named these sites. So if anyone in the audience or on TV owns one of these sites, we ask for forgiveness because we've done drawings proposing to change it in some way. So, but these 8 different sites, we've done just very conceptual studies to illustrate kind of, a first cut look and feel of, what these things might be. So, but this is part of what is needed in a downtown plan like this is to see the choices and see where you can get. So anyway, the first level of effort that we would propose for the village would be to regulate, simply adopt a code and sit back. So we've done some illustrations to show what that looks like, and I may need Tim's help either to see this or describe this. Is this full volume?
That's the full volume. And I was just going to say, Doug, if you do want to you zoom in on anything, the trick would be with the control and then the mouse. And then the hand, can help you point to certain places.
I may ask Tim to do that. Okay, so don't go away, My advice, if you have an office, keep younger people around you. So what this does is essentially says, the village has adopted a form-based code, and it asks that new redevelopments and new construction, the buildings are closer to the sidewalk and have a front door and windows and so on, facing the street. And so, but this does not assume that any of those streets, those new streets or lanes are built, and it does not assume that any of the land has been assembled. So if you've got a lot of parcels like that undeveloped or underdeveloped area west of the post office, there's 6 or 7 parcels. Oh, that's better, thank you. There's 6 or 7 parcels, each of which remains, 6 or 7 parcels. And in that scenario, each of which gets their own driveway, sometimes 2. So there will never be a median there because of all the driveways, and it's kind of a circular argument. So Tim, you want to lead us through this one? I think you prepared it.
Well, the idea with this one is essentially that we're not messing with property lines. First of all, we're not assembling parcels. This is a bit of an every man for himself scenario. So if you have to get into your property, you have, like Doug said, you do have a curb cut. So I'm just going to zoom in on a couple places here, just to call attention to what's going on here. As an extreme example, some of these lots are awfully narrow, and what we just wanted to illustrate was a range of things that might happen there, just to spur conversation. You might think that a property this wide, is about 70 feet wide, would just have one building on it. Well, there's all kinds of ways to put more buildings than that. This happens to be a copy-paste of a project in Mississippi that is awfully charming. Maybe it's not appropriate for wheeling, but it does fit. This is an example here of a property where it may be even subdivided into different parcels that can then have a building on it that is a mixed-use building, some ground floor commercial, some apartments above it. Over here, similar examples like that, where maybe there's some of this missing middle housing type that Doug talked about earlier, the courtyard kind of things, the townhouses, the individual fourplex building with the ground floor commercial. But these are all relying on having access to Dundee and not having any sort of consolidated rear alley, which is what you're going to see in some of the next ones. In case anybody is wondering what this is all about, it's just one of the exciting opportunities here, of course, is what happens with the area west of the tracks. If you think naturally, if the town center wants to grow, that seems like the direction it's going to grow, and there will be hopefully some kind of strengthened connection across the train tracks. But in any case, some of the parcels here have already been sort of consolidated, and all this is showing is literally a Topgolf because it happens to fit. A Topgolf has an absolutely formulaic, that is exactly the size that they always build. It always must have the building on the south side because you don't want to look into the sun and all that kind of stuff. So it happens to fit. Maybe it's not a Topgolf, but maybe it's even, we spoke with Larry and Jan yesterday about the fact that Chevy Chase doesn't have a driving range. So maybe that's a driving range, and there's some opportunity to partner with the Park District. One of the things that we were doing over the last few days was talking to not only property owners, but for anybody that we think might be able to have common interests, cooperate in different ways. Maybe there's ways that the Park District could take advantage of opportunities over here, or at the very least, we're not encouraging things to happen here that conflict with them or conflict with anyone else. The last thing, just to show down here, which will hopefully show up in some images that are like exciting images that I just want to mention now, and we'll get to it more later, is Doug, can I say this part? All right, so this is something I'm excited about, so I'll go ahead and take the chance to say it, is if one Wheeling Town Center is a certain refinement of architecture, and the Uptown 500 is urban, and it's cool, we love that. But maybe the stuff that happens on the west side of the tracks doesn't try to compete with that. It says instead it embraces a little bit more of a raw, rugged look. Maybe it brands itself, has a theme that relates more to the industrial feel of it, the train track. Maybe it has some cool and funky name like Depot something, Station Square, these kinds of things. So the stuff that's happening down here, this little sprinkle, of course, we didn't say it, maybe it's obvious, the pink stuff is new and the gray stuff is old. So maybe you don't try to necessarily get rid of all these buildings. You let them stay and embrace the brick and the things that have that a little bit of wear and tear, but a little bit of character, the authenticity that you don't get from a new building. So we think there's an opportunity to do that sort of thing.
Tim, you transported us all. Well, you want to, get up here, no.
Okay, yeah. I'm just going to carry on a little bit here. So this is also very interesting. I'm going to go back one slide. So when you see a rectangle that looks like this, what's pretty cool about it as a missing middle sort of thing is that is a type of building that actually threads a needle. It has this really cool overlap of the building code of most zoning codes and what it takes to actually get a building built in terms of financing. And so it's a formula here. There's if you make a building that has 4 apartments and no more than 4 apartments, but up to 4 apartments, and no more than 50% of it is commercial space, you take that thing to a bank and just go talk to the folks who deal with regular home loans. It's not a fancy mixed-use product or anything like that. It's just a regular, because they think, believe it or not, 4 cottages, that's not 4 things, that's a home as far as they're concerned. This thing here with the 4 units in the mixed use, that's a home. So it's not a complicated thing for somebody. Maybe there's somebody in Wheeling that lives over here and they've always wanted to open their little business close by. Maybe all of a sudden now they dip their toes in the water and they get to be a developer on their own. And if they actually occupy one of the units, then they can even take advantage of, like an FHA loan, put 3% down or 3.5%, whatever it is, and suddenly it's really attainable. So that's one thing that we were just excited to share. There's that thing that I mentioned in Mississippi. These little, it's got character, it's got charm. And then, so Doug, let me call you back up here, because this is the important thing that the steering committee did ask us to do, is at the end of the day, let's break this thing down into pros and cons for you.
Yeah, so this is the pros and cons of just the first level of effort, which is the village would just regulate and do nothing else. First thing is it improves, shifting from a standard code to a form-based code improves predictability. People know what they're in for, it's clear what rules will apply to them, and so on. Time and again across the country, form-based codes result in a higher quality project. It just shifting to a graphic basis alone seems to help elevate the quality. It certainly advances a walkability agenda by placing the buildings in the correct placement on a site, as well as asking that their frontages have entries and windows and things in the right places. Of the 3 levels we're proposing here, this one has the least effort on the part of the village, both time, money, and low staff burden. Cons, it has the lowest return on investment. You'll see when you see the next couple of schemes, those investments in access and investments in assemblage really can break open some of the development potential and also enhance its quality a great bit. The cons is, and we're recommending, in full disclosure, we do write form-based codes, so, are we self-dealing here, whatever, but, we recommend that you can do a lot of it in-house, but, don't do it all on your own. So pros and cons. Any questions on this, or should we just go through the 3 maybe, and it's probably easiest to discuss. A lot of the questions I think you may have will be answered when we see the next one. So next level, we call this facilitate, and this is really this idea of intervening to cause these connections to take place on all of these sort of isolated choppy parcels. And so this could be done a number of ways. It could be done through easements, negotiated easements with landowners. It could be with a much more active role on the part of the village to, build the street or build the road. And so those are all TBD. Everything here is shown just as a dashed line, does not distinguish between pedestrian path, drive path, and so on. Some of the connections, let me see if I can point to it. Like these guys here, I'm always sort of scared to show them, but we think it's important that there be pedestrian connections from, to the train station back to this neighborhood. So, where it is, what form it takes place, it's most important to be a pedestrian connection. If it were a street connection, that's probably even better, but we don't like to draw drawings over people's houses. So, but anyway, but the rest of it is the bigger things, like the parcel west of the post office, the parcel we call this south of Dundee here, and then the kind of Kmart, Chevy combined site. Those are some real opportunities to create some great connections. Also, we met with the owner, right, of Lynn Plaza. this idea for the Buffalo Creek Trail, which you can see kind of there a little bit in the background. We were delighted to see how tall the bridge was above the water's surface. You know, it's 12 or 15 feet. Unless there's a flood condition, it seemed like quite ample for an under bridge passage. When we met with the owner here, he was interested in knowing how he could enhance his property. And so we said, well, wouldn't it be neat if people could get to the backside? And one way to do it is certainly if this trail were built in the future. The other one was to open up this corner, because you can't get from here to the land back here. And so we'll show you in a minute, you know, some connections there. And he was listening. There we go, right? So, you know, you could get these neighbors to be able to walk under the passage across the bridge and come and, you know, enjoy, you know, spend money, purchase things and so on at Lynn Plaza. So I hope he's watching right now somewhere and is very excited to start construction on this proposal and to help fund the underbridge passage that'll get customers to his shop. So crude little sketch, but you can see what we're up to. Tim, you want to weigh in here on the play space?
So this is back to that property west of the train tracks. And one thing I didn't mention about that idea of using it in basically a recreational way, some kind of non-residential way, is that if it turns out that there's really expensive remediation required to do some kind of residential thing there, maybe in the short or mid-term we can find ways to use that land to make it actually an amenity for all the rest of the stuff, whether that's a driving range or whether that's reusing the building that the village owns now. I haven't been inside of it, but I think it probably has high ceilings. It seems warehousey kind of thing. Maybe it's one of these jump zone kind of stuff, some kind of indoor playground. That could be a great amenity for families that live around there, I think. And then in terms of the, you know what, I'm going to go back here just 1 second and show that now in this drawing, we're sprinkling in some new buildings and doing that in a way that reminds me of a couple of national examples that I know of that I think are so cool. One is actually shown here. It's the American Tobacco Campus in Durham, North Carolina. Actually, the one on the right is the Tobacco Campus in Durham, North Carolina. And it has a bunch of old existing buildings that they repurposed in different ways, but what they did it in a way that really embraced the kind of the historic, the character of the brick. When they added awnings, they did it with, you know, like regular corrugated metal and things like that. And I could imagine, and the one on the left actually is called the Pearl District in San Antonio. And the character of that architecture is pretty cool, and it makes it feel like it has a theme, like it has a certain quality and character that isn't necessarily the most expensive way to make a building, but it works for them. And here are just a couple more images, and I couldn't help but think that where in the Raleigh example, they kept the water tower and the smokestacks, and they have signage on it. And what if some of that stuff in the Ozinga, the tall vertical elements, were just left there, almost as like a relic, an artifact, but it gives it some of that character. The inside of the buildings could look like something like this. So it's not trying to compete with something that's absolutely finished the way that you would expect in an urban place, but it's different, you know. And then these examples which we're just showing, in some of the cases where we are showing the pink rectangles quite close to the street, and you have a hard time imagining what in the world could that be, it's too close to things. Well, if you have it a few steps up, and even if we had, like, let's say a little couple foot tall garden wall here kind of thing and a little bit more plantings, maybe then you can start to imagine buildings like this quite close to the street. So that's the reason we showed that example. And you're just back to the idea of the form-based code. If there are architectural design guidelines in there, is a way to make sure, because you can make this kind of density and lack of articulation horrendous and an absolute horror. So you just have to be careful that you have good composition, good materials, things like that.
This is the pros and cons for that second level of effort to facilitate. So this, we believe, would achieve some local level transformation. That is to say, if you knew Wheeling before, after this level of intervention, it's changed, and it would be impossible not to see it, and it would be, I think, attract local, meaning regional notice. Obviously, it continues to improve predictability and quality, advances a walkability agenda. It's, as opposed to the first one, it's a moderate level of village effort, a moderate staff burden, and begins in fostering a lot more development. It can feed the TIF, if that's important to you. Cons, oops, I think that's a typo, high ROI. Bridget. So it should be a pro. It's a high return on investment. So it's in the wrong place. And this is another pro. It's in the wrong place. Accelerates development by years, because there's some, particularly like the parcels west of the post office are kind of landlocked. It's very hard to kind of get enough of them to do much with. So if that street or access were provided in the back, it just frees them all up. I think it would unstick a stuck area. And then a con, the only true con is, you know, you're going to spend a little more money. And in the case that you were actually building the streets and lanes, you know, there'd be some construction costs. So, so sorry about those misclassifications. Third one, we'll get through these and then we can start talking. Participate. So this is zone it with a walkable code. Set in motion the connections, the lanes and streets that, you know, make all these things possible, and then help with assemblage. So that is to encourage on the parcel west of the post office, on the parcel south of Dundee, Kmart, Chevy, all those sites, cooperation and or assemblage amongst all those landowners. So I'm going to again call Tim up here to talk this one through.
Okay, so just a couple of things to point out here. Whereas, actually, I'm going to back up just for 1 second to show the difference. So let's take one of the more challenging areas here, where we have a whole lot of curb cuts currently. Well, if there were just a shared access drive aisle along the back side of this, then that would free up, you know, the Dundee side there to not necessarily need quite so many curb cuts. So that's the idea. That's the idea there. Again, it shows up in this case also that this extension of Community Boulevard, if that ran along the north side of the property, our understanding is that that's within a floodway anyways. So if a building can't get built there, it makes even more sense in our minds to try to use it in that way. And skip ahead here. One last thing to point out here too is, speaking of unbuildable land, underneath the power lines here, you can't do anything, you can't do a whole lot, but you can park cars there. So we thought that if development happened in here that may need more parking, it might make a lot of sense to utilize that space for parking and free up the land here to be, you know, to have a less actual parking. Okay, so back to this one. A lot of the things are consistent in the two. This one is just showing that if all of these parcels were assembled, you could end up with something that feels a little bit more coherent, I guess, pulled together. But again, no additional curb cuts needed necessarily in there. If they were, they're probably a right in, right out. And in this case, we're just showing different kind of building product types. If it turns out that these little kind of one-off buildings were, for one reason or another, less attractive than a larger building, well, if you had one property owner here, or let's say in some kind of consolidation, then you could actually have a whole lot more parking back here, just basically a double-loaded lane of parking that might come pretty close to taking care of that level of development there. This slide, I guess, was just, this isn't any particular corner, it's just to say that we understand that one thing that's important to this commission is that whatever's built here has a certain character, a certain presence, I think, that is consistent with what's already happening here with the Uptown 500, that you don't want to see something that feels, you know, like sort of in 30 years you look back and it's disappointing, let's say. So we would just advise that whether that's this, anytime that you have this kind of triangular shaped corner here, you always kind of think of these iconic buildings, the Flatiron, things like that. So I think that's what this next slide was showing, that in those kinds of places, pull the building, we would recommend, go ahead and pull the building up to the corner and find a way to make it a little bit taller, higher elements, things like that. Maybe something like that happens on that corner, for example. And by the way, a lot of times what we do is we'll like literally copy and paste footprints of existing things in there at the exact same size so that we know that we're being realistic about it. This footprint here is exactly this. Doug?
So this is the third and final, just I'll call out what's different. So the level of transformation, once you could assemble all those parcels, is what we're considering kind of a regional big deal transformation. It's not, you got to go to Wheeling. It's nothing like it was. It's really incredible. So all the things are amped up, most effort, most benefit, most, kind of most investment. So really that's kind of the summary of those. Shall we bring the lights up and see if there are any questions? We've just sort of given you a fire hose of a lot of quick ideas, and I'm sure you'll have questions and hopefully some discussion. While the lights are coming up, one thought we have, and I would not expect it of you tonight, but on a kind of quadrant by quadrant basis, the kind of the Kmart site as its own thing, and the one west of the post office and so on, it might make sense for the recommendation coming from this commission to take the form of, well, for that site, we think the zoning alone, that's kind of what we want to do there. But that one, you know what, it's just stuck in the quagmire. We need to build a street there. And that one, wow, that one, we need the full boat. We need to really help those people assemble land for something to happen there. So I'm not saying that you have to pick one, all, and do that everywhere, two, and do that everywhere, three, and do that everywhere. I expect you would cut and paste and figure out the right level of effort based on our understanding of the constraints of that site. Does that make sense? So, yeah, we're not recommending what those are now. So that's what you guys get the big bucks for. So, so that's, anyway, I'll stop, and hopefully there are questions and we can discuss.
So of those three that you brought here, and this is probably more toward Bridget, are they equal in increasing the amount of heads there? Is because that's one of the keys that you talked about, was increasing the number of units, people, heads, or whatever. So do all three of them produce the same amount?
No, and I think what's important is there's intensity that goes with each of these. And and I also want to say, as you saw the guidance, we could go back to that slide, the guidance that came out of the other communities. The guidance I didn't put there was some of the communities that are very, very walkable. We were talking about a number of about 5,000 for the Mount Prospects, the Arlington Heights, the Park Ridges. When you get to the places that you say, wow, nobody even needs a car there, the Evanstons, the Oak Parks, you're at 12, 13,000. So there's nothing wrong with beating those and putting more residential. I mean, one of the points, if I can get back, yeah, I don't know if I can make this get bigger, do I? I don't know. But anyway, the point is, a lot of this is residential. And I've done a lot of work with retailers today, and a lot of the sites you have, the goal is to increase the sales per square foot in existing retail rather than build a lot more retail at lower per square foot sales. And so that's why the more people you add, the more of a local economy you create that spends money there. Plus, people are attracted from the distance. But that's what you're seeing today as a goal for retailers. Is you got a great person working with you, John, I think would second that when I talk to you, is it's not getting more retail, it's making every retailer you get count and be successful. And so adding more people. So I said like a minimum after you finish your 900, we thought a minimum was another about 350. But you could go to 500 or 600, but it's not the same kind of units. Again, the goal, like you saw a lot of in, Doug or Tim could comment more on this. You saw the introduction of a lot of townhome type products, row house products that people would move up in. I mean, I had a discussion with some people about where, as you get young families, it's not senior resident, but it's a place where the grandparents can move to be closer and be there to babysit. I sort of joke, having grown up in the helicopter parent age with kids that age now there's helicopter grandparents, and where your grandmother used to move to Florida, now the grandmothers live in the cheaper house next door or something. And that's really a lifestyle, multi-generational living. Doug could talk a lot about this middle market where you have accessory buildings and families living kind of closer together. And so we're looking at products like that to build a real feeling of community and a fact that what you got is such a great introduction happening now with the apartments. You want to make sure those become permanent Wheeling residents as they create entrepreneurial businesses and they grow into home ownership. You don't want them to leave, which I think Wheeling, in some respects, has been an introductory community. And what the opportunity you have here is to build that long-term resident through the creative use of different products and proving up in the market this. And I just want to clear up that ROI thing, because this was a charrette. It was going the whole time. And what we were really looking at, the disadvantage was the amount of investment required, so that each time you had to get a higher amount of investment, and it wasn't necessarily always the return. And one of the other questions that I a lot of times get is, the more intense the improvement is, where you have a TIF district, the higher you have the ability to support it. So looking for keeping that intenser development inside of a tax increment district is also important in a product like this. And these are the sorts of things we'll do as we refine the charrette documents. So long answer to your question, but I wanted to be sure that you saw how we're working together, and it's the beginning of the process, not the end.
I'm going to make the answer just a little bit longer, Jim, just to add to that, because I think that the question of which one has the capacity to hold more higher density, probably when you start to assemble parcels, you will find that, just because if at the end of the day, inefficient drive lanes and parking takes up a lot of space that could otherwise be buildings. So like the example over here in this part, when all of those folks needed to set aside 20 or 25 feet or 30 feet just to get the car to get in there, that could otherwise be building. So because of the parking car issue, I would think that assembling parcels is going to get you more folks. Yeah.
Do you guys have, maybe not necessarily projects that you've done specifically, but do you have examples of each of those three phases locally of townships that have done each sort of option that we could draw parallels to? Or even close?
Yeah, so...
just so we know what's, what.
The answer is yes, I'm sure we can. They are like top of mind right now,
right.
Kind of pure examples. And I will say that my advice to all the towns we work with is, if your game is, let's do a road trip, and let's, either get them to come here or go kick the tires there on a Saturday or something like that. So, because, I believe what we've shared is, true to the best of my recollection, all that kind of stuff. But we are not in the same seat that you are, so, and or your council and trustees. So I love it when electeds and plannings kind of get together and say, what did you think about this? What was the tipping point for you to decide to go this way rather than that? How long did it take you? What were the bumps in the road? Just, it's a new adventure, new journey, you should say, not adventure, journey, that the town would undertake, village would undertake. So I'd be glad to put you in touch with folk on that.
I'm just curious. Palatine wasn't always Palatine. Arlington Heights the same. They went over some conversion over the years. So what do towns like that we might strive to be more like with the downtown area?
Yeah.
Which phase historically would they? I don't know. I'm just trying to.
Joe, it's a good point, and now it's out there, and that as this moves forward through the process, that's something that Andrew and Steve can. It's here on public record now that they could convey to the village board as they see that would be a good idea to do something like that. Yeah.
I was just going to say, just quickly, one of our clients is Orland Park, and we did a TOD plan for them for the 143rd and LaGrange Road Triangle. We did that plan in 1999.
I went to high school, I graduated in 99 in Frankfurt, so I was right there when that all happened.
So the
I
mayor
watched
there
it.
was Dan McLaughlin, and they had, check this out, a cement plant they had to relocate. They had inaccessible landlocked land that needed new streets to get there. They had to assemble the parcels, and they've built their first 2 buildings. They just had an RFP for basically all the remaining parcels. So just the other thing I'm respectful of and mindful of is time and shaving years off things. So there's some towns it's not moving very fast and we don't really care. Other places my advice is if it's there and the demand is there and it's kind of the private sector can't get to it but for some municipal action to kind of unleash it, don't wait. I mean, just make your community better sooner. So but anyway, that project is, now in year 19. You laugh. No, they're all.
I remember seeing it.
We started
crazy.
doing this in high school. I mean, you have to be a young person to be in this game.
No, Doug, I was just going to say, on the other end of the spectrum, I can't help but think of Mundelein, which it has a lot of similarities to this, except they're super active and have gotten a lot done just in the last few years through acquiring properties here and there and just little transformations that have had a huge effect just in the last few years.
So one of the items that I think I discussed yesterday is, keeping these residents here in this walkable area, this half-mile area. So the next transition to that is, if they're in an apartment or a townhome, is a single-family home. And, the impression, and you said it, Bridget, is that this is a starting point for folks and then they move out. So besides the stationary plan, then we as a village need to have a bigger plan also to keep people here, not just in this half-mile radius, but outside of that. So it's in my eyes, it's greater than just the station area plan that we're working on, that we need to do something outside of that. Yeah. You discussed the Park District and our great Park District, and it is a great Park District. So there's other areas, what is our housing mix outside of this half-mile radius that we need to talk about and incentivize folks to build bigger homes in some areas. So that's probably more of a statement, but it ties to keeping people here.
Yeah. So we really don't have anything to show you about it, but we thought long and hard about, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of this. Dunhurst, and then another one over here. Meadowbrook, yeah. So those are, very well served by the train station. So to a commuter or someone wanting to ride the train, access jobs and services elsewhere, those are good locations.
And maybe those access points that you talk about will bring those folks.
Yeah, yeah. And, it's not for tonight, but for another day, the housing stock is of an age that it's kind of ready. Some of it needs investment. And so, a plan like this can send a signal to say, yes, you should repair your roof because your house has a future, or no, there's uncertainty, don't invest, whatever. So whatever the Plan Commission decides, I think clarity is a good thing. I will also say, and I think, again, we don't have anything to show on this, but just professional opinion, there's a bunch of ways that people can, improve their stuff, and this maybe is where I want to call Bridget back up. If you had a house and you could add on to it, or add a second unit, like as Bridget was saying, like if Grandma could live downstairs or out back, that's also it doesn't have to be a tear down in a 6,000 square foot house replaces what's there now. It could be sort of smaller incremental benefits that could add a lot of value for families and keep them in town. And
that's what we want to do.
Yeah,
We've got,
no one wants to displace anybody.
right,
So.
and we want people, we want residents to move up.
Yep.
And to stay here and make this a destination because of our amenities and what we have to offer here.
Yeah, and I'll just say, this is, again, a conversation for another night, but there's a lot of innovation going on right now in the country. When you look at the life cycle of a family, you start out, you started as a renter with roommates, and then you get your own place, and then maybe you become a couple, then you add kids, and your needs kind of change half a dozen times through life, and then you don't want to mow a lawn, and then you can't climb stairs, and so the kind of this whole thing. But my wife and I are experiencing this. We have a 4-bedroom house, and there's 2 of us.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it have been great if the house was designed so that without having to tear it down, 1 or 2 of those bedrooms were a little rental unit, and we could go down to a 2-bedroom and have the same house. So the design, they're all called flex houses, something called a flex. So that could be a really cool thing. When your family needs it, it's 1 unit. When you don't need it, you lock the door or build that 1 wall, and you're good as a rental unit. So, and zoning can enable that. So,
I've tried to talk all my kids into getting first floor in-law suites so we can just travel around, but
how's that going for you?
it's not working for me
Not working
yet.
so far.
But I mean, those are the types of things that this is my own personal opinion that we need. We've got the largest generation now retiring.
Yeah.
The baby boomers, they're all retiring. So and then, the millennials, and I still don't know what that definition means, but they're coming up, but there's less of them. So there's a whole lot of churn in our population,
You're right. And the point, I just want to really emphasize that I love hearing the creativity out of this group, because this is an area for creativity, and there are lots of great studies. And as Doug said, we'd love to help you through, as this plan kind of evolves a little bit, understanding which pieces of that creativity may best fit your area. But I also wanted to mention that what keeps people staying in a community is connections. And it's that they love working out at that park district. Today's kids, entrepreneurship is a huge piece of it. And to keep the kind of flex space that you have west of the tracks now, just enough of it. Like, I joked with Tim I was going to steal one of his pictures, which was, we both used the same picture, where imagine adding that cool awning to the brick flex buildings you have there, making them cool, but still affordable for entrepreneurs so they can put their money into hiring employees or building their business and being able to walk to work. And, that's the environment you're creating here, which would differentiate Wheeling from many, many of the communities around here. And that's really what you're doing. So why would you move to Buffalo Grove where you can't walk? That's really what you're doing here, is you're creating the connection to the community, to the lifestyle that all of the studies are. And I just haven't given you my new line for villages. If I'd been here in 2008, I would have had a really great crystal ball, and I would have told you what was going to happen. And then something did happen that most of us know about, called the housing crisis and the Great Recession. So now I joke with communities that I have a cloudy crystal ball right now, but it's got some really interesting things in that cloud. And that's what you're really talking about, is the creativity that is going to allow this to be a very special area by really focusing on the walkability and understanding that walkability is no good if there aren't any people there to walk. So you could create, I can tell you about environments here that have been created when they didn't put the people in it. And it's the sidewalk's there and you don't see anybody. So, that's, and just as you're starting to think about these housing projects, the last thing that I would add here is a lot of people look at something like the Glen, which was a transformative product. The fastest selling housing type, and they only put a few of them in there, was the 2 flats. Have you guys heard of them? They're in the Cambridge section. It's just a few of the units. Go look at, what you'll notice though is there's a ground floor unit that's a English basement, and then 2 stories above it in single family there. So it was the fastest selling product, couldn't get enough of it, but Glenview was afraid to allow a lot of that. And it had to do with HUD requirements and things, and that's why Doug said this is complicated, you need to be careful on your zoning. But if you wonder, is that product out there, it is, and it works really well.
Thank you. So I was going to just correct myself and build on what Tim said about time to answer your question. Work we did for the village of Mundelein, we finished our plan in December of whatever year that was, and by the following November, the streets were all built. So it wasn't as fast as they do it in China, but it was pretty darn fast for municipalities, so under 1 year. So
And which sort of phase did they, I mean, that was,
the streets, yeah.
okay. So
And
it's
there was a
pretty
bill-
major stuff.
Yeah, it was the streets, and actually they were moving their town hall to face the street, which is kind of why they needed the street in place to be able to build their building. So, and each of these, in my mind, just based on experience, I could sort of annotate over each of these sections and say, that one will go faster, that one will go slower, that one's dead last, and so on. But we are big believers in putting it on a timeline. Moving a cement plant is 5 to 20 years, so when do you want it? You get started sooner if you want it sooner, that kind of thing. So, or maybe 3 to 20 years, but all these have timelines. But what I was going to say was maybe this has been a good presentation. I'm sure you will all have other questions, but I think the next steps are we will correct some typos from tonight, because we certainly saw a few.
I saw parallel spelled wrong.
Yeah, Parrell.
Parallel.
It's not, Jim, it wasn't parallel, it's a new term called Parrell.
Like a charrette.
Charrette,
Never heard of that
exactly,
before either.
Parrell, charrette. Yeah, so we'll get the typos fixed, we'll get the things, pros and cons sorted out correctly. We'll get that to Andrew and we'll get it uploaded. I think Andrew, you will serve as our kind of point of contact for both public comment and then guidance from Plan Commission, and we'll be working closely with Andrew and his staff to bring back to you the next time. And I think we meet with Plan Commission sometime January-ish?
Yeah, we are finding the date, but yeah, the idea of it is to firm it up, get the public comment out there, and then turn it into a document that includes the implementation, recommendations, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. If I could, while my mic is turned on.
Thank you, Doug.
Just a couple of notes to sort of wrap up where the staff discussion of this went and the steering committee. When we first sat down with Doug and the team, we talked about a few goals that we had for this, addressing our lack of predictability of our processes. We explained to them that we felt that our own procedures were somewhat of a constraint to the development in that our zoning entitlement, because of the way the zoning code is written, we talked about this at our joint meeting a couple of times, but because of the way our zoning code is written, it relies on the developer to get most of the way through the zoning entitlement process to have a pretty good idea of exactly what it is they can build. What we're suggesting is that there might be an opportunity to improve the predictability of this process. And to not view it as a loss of control, but just shifting the mindset of where your control is. Your control is still there. Your control is exercised through defining your vision more clearly at the front. The form-based code, I think, allows that. So I think that they've done a pretty good job of giving us a tool that addresses that issue. It also addresses the issue that we identified coming off of the other plan being functionally obsolete in a relatively, not an abnormal amount of time. I think 10 years for a plan to live out its life as the original stationary plan did, not that unusual. But the degree to which it became obsolete, I think we wanted them to try to come up with something that was a little bit more flexible. Again, the form-based code does seem to do that. It gives you the flexibility that if the market changes, what you're stressing to the development world is we want it to look like this. We want people to, the values that we have here are, we want people to live here, work here, walk here, enjoy this. Even if the market changes, the form that we are prescribing for that area is pretty similar. So I think, again, the form-based code does that. Just a couple of other thoughts. The implementation section I touched on, we will be working with them on the development of this as a plan. By the time you see it as a document, it should have some of these things that were discussed tonight spelled out here. The IDOT, for example, if you're going to pursue the option that involves significant improvements to Dundee Road, here are the steps that you need to take to even ask the question. some of the things you talked about tonight are strategic plan items. The board does periodically update the strategic plan. The idea of making sure that we are doing what we can to house people through all phases of life is something that's spillover from strategic plan to comp plan to zoning code. Let me see. I got the note on the road trip. I guess the question for this to move it on to the web at this point, we do want people to provide feedback. This plan is going to be improved significantly by having an idea of what people think of it. People can certainly find it once it's posted. It will not be a very long time before it is posted, but we really truly do want people to look at this. We talked about what's the best way to do that. Probably some level of feedback forms, surveys will be posted with it. We want to hear from people to make sure that we're really incorporating the thoughts of the community in this, thoughts of the Plan Commission. You don't have to give them all tonight. Think about it, read through it once you see it refined, and submit your own thoughts. That would be fantastic. But thank you all for all your comments tonight.
I was just going to ask that, and you answered it for me.
And thanks to the group. I think it was the charrette, I think, was a really good idea to do this in this way.
Right. I did want to see a cart, though, with everybody sitting on it at one point or another, but I didn't see that, so we'll have next time.
Andrew, just what are you going to provide for the general public to look at? I mean, some of this is pretty high level, and, you know, will they understand?
Well, a lot of it is, I mean, you've seen, I think, this is the result of 3 days. I'm notwithstanding the career that you put into this, but the 3 days of work that you guys see as a result now, I think the team here will be able to put together some graphics to illustrate the concepts so that when you see you see this plan forming, the preferred option forming, there will be graphics with it to help illustrate the concepts. I think, is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
So what you'll see posted online will not be this presentation exactly. It'll be some version. I don't know if I'm putting the wrong terminology on it here, but you'll see elements of this. You'll see the overall development, what the impact is of the additional intervention by the village to consolidate curb cuts, to assemble properties. The higher level of intervention causes these things. It comes at a cost, but it does produce a different built form. But just to follow up on one quick thought regarding the speed, the TIF district has a life. The market has cycles. It is important to us, I think, to get through this planning process sooner rather than later. Our TIF district, the Town Center 2 TIF district, the longer that TIF district has left on it, the easier it is for a project to be financed with that incentive. The speed at which a plan like this could be approved and ready for implementation, when you have the changes that we're seeing and experiencing here in Wheeling right now, it is important to have a plan in place that can deal with the development of this market while that market is still developing. Of course, it would have been nice to have it a little bit earlier, but I think to be able to capture this momentum of development through a plan like this would also be ideal. So we do want to keep this moving. We want to keep the momentum to have this approved so that we can work on the implementation of it as soon as it's practical.
One of the things that I would like to see when we talked about the form-based coding is to actually take, if it's possible, to take a segment of our code right now and convert it to this form-based that you're talking about. So we get an actual idea. I know you showed an example. I don't know. I didn't know what that was. I don't know if it was relevant to us. But if that could be done for Plan Commission purposes, for their sake, and actually, I'm sure the village board would like to see that too, because I understand diagrams and things like that, but how does it translate to what we currently have?
Yeah.
You know, words, I know you said words versus pictures, but a little example would be helpful.
So what we were planning to do, let me share that and we'll see if this gets you what you need. So was to do some sort of context zone overlay here to say, just say, this stretch is walking, and this stretch can be, car. And then if there's something that's a mixed, or transitional, we would try our best to map that. So we did a sketch, which didn't make this presentation, so we'll generate that. And what we could do for just illustration purposes would be to take, I think that would be too bad, to take a patch of your text-based regulation now on the left and say, by comparison, this could be regulated in this way.
Right, exactly.
Some version of that. And
Sure.
we may be cutting and pasting from prior work.
Oh, yeah.
We're not, writing it for you, but you kind of get what that's about. What I'll say about the form-based codes, if you're a developer or a homeowner or anybody, the best form-based codes, which is what we do, is you can get for a site, you look it up and say, on this site, there's different schools of philosophy about how to do form-based codes. The one there are two, one's called a frontage code, which is you just sort of take a section through a street and you say, kind of the buildings have to be here and they can be this tall, and what happens internal to them, we don't care. And that's a very easy, I don't favor it because it can, you can miss some stuff. You can get still some low quality stuff. So we tend to like to regulate it by building type. And so what you'll get is I'm a developer, I own that parcel, these 6 building types are permitted there. Building type 2 is illustrated in everything I need to know on a 2-page spread. So, normally it's like now I have to go to the parking chapter for the parking, the setbacks chapter for the setbacks. No, 2 pages, everything, all graphically. You open it up, and if you do a spine binding, like you just lay it flat, and okay, I get that. But what if I want to do building type 3? Well, that's on the next page. Okay, I get it. So it's really, really clear. So we'll send you some examples of where we've done that in the past.
Right, okay, excellent.
It's pretty cool.
Well, I think we have the path forward now.
Cool.
So thank you all.
We have some leftover donuts from Monday, or Tuesday, if anyone would like them.
Right, thank you.
Anyway, thanks for this opportunity. We really loved it. Thanks for everybody that hung out for your input, and it's a good process. And thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks.
And Andrew, you have one more thing that we wanted to discuss under other business?
Yeah,
Unrelated to this.
totally unrelated, since the entire meeting was under other business.
Right, was other business.
I was talking to Jim earlier this week about the items that are going to the board for Monday night. Thank you all.
Thank you.
We'll leave you a pile of trash, right? Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice holiday.
I was talking to Jim, as I was saying earlier this week, about the items that are going to the board Monday night, and just explaining part of the process that since we had the opportunity to be here tonight, Jim and I thought it would be a good idea to just talk through it briefly. When items leave the Plan Commission, when you have a recommendation that's made, we have a additional report that goes on to the board after that. We do another bite at the staff report. We say, here's what happened at the Plan Commission. We tend to detail if the developer or the petitioner has changed anything, which is rare. We explain exactly what changed, and we'll say, Plan Commission requested these items be addressed. This one plan has been changed to illustrate that. So we have a section of the staff report that goes to the board that handles that. We also have my recommendation, the director's recommendation. Typically, that recommendation is I concur with the Plan Commission. Here's the conditions of approval suggested by the Plan Commission. We do occasionally modify those conditions slightly, just for wording, just to clarify exactly. We'll go back through the meeting, watch it, check the minutes, and make sure that we're capturing what the intent of the Plan Commission was. Occasionally, and this is fairly rare, we have the benefit of slowing things down and looking through what those conditions mean, and we kind of think through the scenario of, well, as a staff, how are we going to implement this in the end? What does this mean to us? Where in the development process does this condition of approval that's been suggested, where does it get implemented? So occasionally we have something like that where we'll look at it and say, we have a concern. I'll say in my board recommendation, I have a little bit of a concern with this condition of approval. here's why. I think that the Plan Commission, the intent I agree with. However, at the point at which we impose that new regulation, the point at which we impose that condition of approval on the development doesn't work out. It's at a point where for whatever reason, they'll need to be done with it either before that or after that. So what I'm saying, I guess, in so many words, is that when I have a recommendation that somehow differs with what the Plan Commission recommendation is, it's spelled out very clearly to the board. The board will see the ordinance exactly how the Plan Commission drafted it. We take those conditions, we paste it in the ordinance, we say here's what the Plan Commission recommended, and then we'll use the staff recommendation to say, the staff has a concern with the following things. We suggest that if the board has the same concern, if the board shares this concern, here's an alternate wording for this condition. But what they'll see is the ordinance as the Plan Commission recommended it. That is happening on Monday night. I did have a condition of approval that in retrospect, again, not during the meeting, having the benefit of additional time to think through it, I did have a concern regarding the car wash condition of approval relating to the right-in, right-out versus full access, and what that would mean in terms of the predictability for that particular development. So I suggested an alternate wording that does allow the developer to move forward. Obviously, it's at their risk until they get full approval from IDOT, but I suggested a condition of approval that's slightly different. Again, the board will see the ordinance, exactly what the conditions the Plan Commission recommended. My recommendation just says, with the benefit of thinking through how this would impact this development, the board may wish to consider an alternate wording for this condition. So talking to Jim through that, he thought that there might be a benefit of explaining how it works. And if you have any questions on it, you certainly ask them now or give me a call.
Andrew, so the only question I have regarding that is your recommendation. That is part of the board packet, but it's also what gets posted on the web, correct? So we would see that like the Friday before the meeting, we'd be able to review that too, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Questions? Questions?
Oh, your time's up.
Yeah, they gotta get the garbage out of there.
The good donuts are still in the trash. I'm sorry, you were saying?
No, I think we're good. Any other comments about this specifically?
Nope.
Okay, so let's go quickly through other business. Don?
I don't have anything tonight.
Tatiana?
Nothing, thank you.
Steve?
Nothing, Jim.
Joe?
Well, since it's sitting right in front of us, December 1st through 9th is Lollipop Lane. It's a free photo with Santa. It's awesome every year. The lights are great. My daughter loves it. It's an absolute awesome time. So.
Yep.
That's
Jeff?
I have nothing, thank you.
I just have happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
I will not be here for the December 6th meeting, just a reminder.
December 6th. Is that our next meeting?
I believe so.
And the holiday calendar,
Yes.
maybe?
Yes, it is.
Yes, the holiday
that's right,
schedule,
holiday,
the
so
meetings
it's
are the
first-
6th.
It's the
and
first
20th.
Thursday. Okay, thank you. So will everyone else be here?
Yes.
Okay. All right, great, thank you. Do I hear a motion to close, adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.